TCU basketball is 6-0. It's not the most intense schedule in the world so far, but things do ramp up starting this weekend. We have Andy Patton with us from Locked On College Basketball. He'll break down things for us next here on Locked On Horned Frogs.
You are Locked On Horned Frogs, your daily podcast on the TCU Horned Frogs, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
That's right. Locked On Horned Frogs, a crossover edition today with one of the hosts of Locked On College Basketball, Andy Patton. He does that show with Isaac Shade, and they do a great job covering the sport. Andy, if folks are interested in that, what's kind of the vibe right now as we're in late November, early December, getting ready for the stretch run of the season?
Yeah, Stephen, first of all, thanks for having me. Appreciate it. Isaac and I have been doing this show for a little over a year now. We're into year two, and I think really hitting our stride. We've had so much fun with it, doing a couple shows a week together. We have some rotating regular guests we like to bring on as well. Obviously, you can find it wherever you find podcasts, wherever you're listening to Locked On Horned Frogs. You can also find us on YouTube. Really, really fun stuff. Obviously, coming off Feast Week, there was a ton of really, really good college basketball games last week. This week, we just had the ACC-SEC Challenge. A lot of fun upsets there. North Carolina over Tennessee was a big one. Arkansas beating Duke, some really fun stuff. And, of course, Big 12 basketball is always a popular topic for us because of how fantastic that conference is.
Andy also does Locked On Zags, and I guess that Big 12 Gonzaga talk has kind of died down, right? Like we had that last year, and it seems like maybe at least for the time being, the conference is going to kind of stay pat.
It's up and down, man. Every other week, it feels like there's another rumor that the conversation is starting again. I know the commissioner, Brett Yormark, he absolutely loves the Zags. He loves college basketball, but I think enough programs in the conference right now are saying, hey, can we just like settle in for a second and kind of wait? We just got 4 schools in. We got 4 more coming next year. And I don't blame some of those schools for saying, let's pump the brakes here. But I do think that it's going to pick up again. I'm pretty confident Yormark really wants to make this work. And as soon as other conferences start showing interest in Gonzaga, if the Big East ever really makes that call, if this Pac-12 Mountain West whatever merger thing happens there, if they start calling Gonzaga, I could see the Big 12 starting to ramp up again. But I think right now it's pretty quiet.
This TCU team, they're 6-0. Now, in typical fashion, kind of with them under Jamie Dixon, it's been a lot of pretty much all home games against teams that they should beat. They did stumble against Pine Bluff last year, so there's been an improvement in staying unscathed so far. I guess we'll start with this. I don't know how much time you've had to watch them or just assess this team, but going into the season, if there's 1 or 2 names, Emmanuel Miller's back, they got Jameer Nelson Jr. and others in the portal. Who were the guys that you were kind of circling like, I want to see how this plays out. I want to see this guy play, in the Big 12 conference over the next few weeks?
Yeah, the biggest name coming into the season, certainly for me, was Jameer Nelson Jr. He's got some really big shoes to fill at the point guard position for TCU. What is that going to look like for him? And early returns have been good and bad. He's not playing a ton of minutes, only about 23 minutes. Part of that, I think, is that TCU is blowing out a bunch of teams. So you're just not seeing the starters on the floor as long as they probably will be against some of the teams they play this weekend, certainly as they get into the Big 12. I've enjoyed what we've seen from him. He's distributing the ball better than he did at Delaware. He's turning the ball over less. I think that's a product of having better teammates. The scoring is a little inconsistent, phenomenal from the free throw line, decent from inside the arc, struggling a little bit from deep. He's never been an elite 3-point shooter. So I don't think the expectation is that he's going to turn into a, 38, 40% guy. He's at 24% right now though. So I suspect that'll probably come up as the year goes on. I've really enjoyed Jacoby Coles, the guy I wasn't as enthused about coming into the year because I didn't think we'd see quite as much of a breakout again. Quality of competition's a little low, but still leading the team, 15.5 points per game, shooting really well, both from inside the arc and beyond the arc. So it's been nice to see him kind of step up into a big role. You mentioned Emmanuel Miller, good to see him as well. I think those are kind of the main guys. I'll toss out Ernest Uday as well. I was really excited about TCU landing him, and he hasn't played big minutes yet, about 15 minutes per game, but he's a quality rim protector, a rim runner, a guy I think could kind of improve as the year goes on as a scorer, and maybe be a guy that TCU fans kind of get gradually more and more excited about as we see him kind of grow and develop.
Yeah, Ernest has just got to stay out of foul trouble. I mean, in these early games, it's like every night he's got 2 quick fouls. Teams are kind of going at him, and obviously he's a shot blocker, so he's getting challenged and trying to erase those deficiencies on the perimeter if there are some. About a year ago, now it's funny because honestly, the 2024 high school class that Jamie's putting together looks pretty solid. Yeah. But about a year ago, I was like, man, it feels like TCU has completely gotten away from recruiting the high school level. It just every season they're kind of turning things over with the portal. But the more I thought about it, Andy, I was like, well, I guess if you're not a blue blood program, in some ways that makes sense. Like if you're not pulling in 5-star XYZ from the high school ranks, what are you seeing in like team building philosophies, transfer portal versus high school, and just how coaches have approached it with, the portal being such a huge part of the sport now?
There's a lot of kind of things that all came together at the same time, which makes it like really difficult to kind of gauge what is the driving force for things. I think transfer portal is obviously huge. Players being able to transfer at least now once kind of for free without having to sit out a year is a massive change. NIL is, of course, a massive change. It's hard to know how much that's impacting roster construction, especially for programs like TCU. I don't know exactly what the impact is, but I think the other thing that doesn't quite get acknowledged as much is that some of these high school classes are a little bit weaker or a little bit harder to gauge because they played a lot of their high school basketball or their late middle school basketball during the kind of COVID years when there was seasons were canceled and players had to transfer schools and AAU wasn't going on. And I think you're just seeing a lot of coaches who are less certain about any high school player that's not a top 15, 20, 25 player. And so I think a lot of teams are saying, well, I can get a guy who average, if I'm Jamie Dixon, like I'd rather get a guy who averaged 20 points per game at Delaware than get a point guard unless he's, unless it's one of the 3 best point guards in the country, unless you can get Jacoby Walter like Baylor did, or Stephon Castle at UConn or Collier at USC. Like those guys are, they're going to be great. The cream rises to the top regardless of some of those challenges. But anybody outside of those top 30, top 25 guys, I think teams are hesitant. If they've seen a guy a lot, if one of their assistants is really in on him, then maybe they'll take a shot there. But I think teams are thinking this class is harder to gauge. They missed a year, 2 years, whatever, of high school basketball. We can go get a guy in the portal who's coming from a mid-major program, who's played Division I basketball. Like it makes a lot of sense to me why coaches, especially programs like TCU that are kind of, in the middle of the Big 12, an NCAA tournament caliber program without a doubt, but not a blue blood, not the Duke, Kansas, Kentucky of the world. And so I think that for them, this is the easiest and I guess safest way to build a roster. And I do think the pendulum will swing eventually. Eventually, high school recruits will become a bit more of a hot commodity. You'll see teams, teams kind of at the cutting edge start going after high school recruits more and building teams that way. I mean, Kentucky looks phenomenal and they're built primarily on freshmen right now. So I think it'll change again, but TCU is one of those teams kind of in the middle where I think they're just trying to figure out what does make the most sense for us. And a lot of coaches are struggling with this right now because of all these changes happening at once.
On the DeAndre Nelson Jr. topic, how much, I guess concern might be the wrong word, but how much of a factor is it coming from Delaware, playing this Big 12 schedule? Is that just a case-by-case thing, or do you feel like the experience at the college level, regardless of what the competition was like, is really invaluable, when you're talking about plugging and immediately having to play on a Power 5 team?
Yeah, it's funny. I think some teams are really good at identifying players who are going to be able to take that leap and kind of play at a different level. And you'll see a lot of teams will add a player and you're like, oh, is that guy going to be, is he going to be able to do it? Is Max Asmus, the guy who averaged 20 points per game for 3 straight years at Oral Roberts, he goes to Texas and there's some concern. Is he going to be able to handle the Big 12? And we'll obviously see as the year goes on, but he's played well. And Texas has played a tough non-conference schedule. Nelson is a guy that I think can probably do it. He is undersized. And I do think that when you're trying to guess which players are going to make that leap, size is a factor. If it's like you're just going to be smaller than all the guys you're going up against, that's certainly a disadvantage. But Nelson has been very productive despite being, on the smaller side. So I do think I'm not super concerned about Nelson. He was a guy that when Isaac and I did our Locked On Big 12 preview, I had I had Nelson as I think a second team all Big 12 player.
Okay.
I'm not as confident about that right now, just because there's a lot of really talented guards in the Big 12, but I think he's capable of being a guy who really steps up. And we've seen, Kansas State had some really fantastic players last year, Marquise Noel, who was a transfer. So certainly it can happen, but it's always a bit of a crapshoot, especially with how deep and talented the Big 12 is.
Georgetown, Clemson, and Arizona State. We'll ask Andy about those teams, which are coming up the schedule. This is Locked On Horned Frogs, your team every day. Guys, I'm not ashamed to admit it. I don't know a lot about cars, about vehicles, maintenance, those types of things, but eBay Motors has made it easy for me. ebaymotors.com, right parts, right fit, right prices. They have a great guaranteed fit product where you can put, the specific part that you're looking at in the cart. You can type in the make and model of your car, and they will quickly tell you, yes, this is a match. No, it's not. You can't mess around when it comes to your vehicle. You want it to be a high-performance machine. Go to ebaymotors.com today. Shop there. They have all kinds. They have a crazy selection. Everything you would need for your car, whether you want to make it more functional or just soup it up and make it look cooler, sound cooler, whatever the case may be. ebaymotors.com, right fit, right parts, right prices. That eBay guaranteed fit is only available to U.S. customers. Make the right decision today and go to ebaymotors.com. Okay, Andy, so Georgetown, they lost a game to Holy Cross earlier this year, I know, but they've seemed to righted the ship at least a little bit. Clemson's off to a really hot start. Arizona State. Of those three kind of non-conference matchups coming up, which one intrigues you the most? Which will be sort of the biggest test for this TCU team?
It's Clemson, and to be honest, it's not incredibly close in my mind. I think Clemson is a borderline top 25 team. I think, frankly, if they win this game against TCU, that will probably push them into the top 25, certainly depending on how some of those other teams near the bottom do this week. But Clemson, they're coming off a really nice win over an Alabama team that is still kind of trying to find themselves, find their pieces. But Alabama's incredibly talented, and Clemson went out and beat them, scored 85 points on them. And I think Arizona State could present a nice challenge as well. They're a really good defensive team. Ken Pom has them 34th in the country right now in adjusted defense. They are not a particularly good offensive team, so I think that will make that somewhat of an interesting matchup. And frankly, Georgetown is not particularly good. I don't think TCU will have a ton of trouble with them. They're on a 4-game winning streak, but it is against Mount St. Mary's, American, Jackson State, and Merrimack, and they did not beat any of those teams by more than 11 points. And so they got victories, which is great, but I think that I really believe in their new coach, Ed Cooley, who's coming over from Providence. I think Georgetown is going to kind of get back to national prominence, but it's not going to happen this year. So I think for TCU, they should be able to take care of Georgetown. Frankly, they should be able to take care of Arizona State, although I think that they have enough talent on that roster to potentially give TCU some fits. But really, it's going to come down to that Clemson game. PJ Hall is back for the Tigers. He's a fantastic player. Joe Girard transferred over from Syracuse. He's been their best player so far this season. And I think Clemson is a top 25 caliber team. I think TCU is a top 25 caliber team, but they haven't played any games that would really kind of push them into that conversation. Clemson is the kind of game where they beat Georgetown, which doesn't move the needle much, and then they beat Clemson. Now they're 8-0. They should start getting some serious top 25 attention at that point. That's why I think that Clemson game is pretty critical for them.
When you look at the Big 12, Houston's involved now, and they've been great for the past 5 years or so. Obviously, Baylor, Texas, Kansas, sort of the usual suspects. Who are some of your favorites? And this has been, an all-out brawl every season for a while now, and it feels like we're kind of headed towards that collision course again here, Andy.
Yeah, Big 12 is absolutely loaded. And, I think a lot of the concern, and we talked about this quite a bit on Locked On College Basketball, was whether the additions, of course, outside of Houston, whether the newcomers were going to actually kind of drag down the conference a little bit. And BYU is the 9th best team in the country, according to Ken Pom. They're a top 25 program. And as you alluded to earlier, I host Locked On Zags. Seeing BYU play really crappy last year in the WCC and now be excellent in the Big 12 is a bit of a bummer, because Gonzaga's kind of feeling the strain with their conference being even worse than usual this year. But BYU looks fantastic. I think Oklahoma, who's obviously on their way out the door, is a better team than many people projected them to be as well. So the Big 12 is better top to bottom than it's been in a long time. Cincinnati is like a top 40 team at Ken Pom as well, a newcomer for them. So I'm really excited about the Big 12, not just at the top, but like pretty much every week is going to be some fantastic games. But at the top, I love Houston. At this point, I have Houston over Kansas. I was a little surprised that the AP voters did not have Houston over Kansas. They had Houston 6th and Kansas 5th. Kansas obviously suffered some losses, but you can't really blame them. Or they lost to Marquette. Marquette's a really good team. I don't think that's a huge issue, but they struggled against Eastern Illinois this week. I think they were coming out. Every team came out of Maui a little bit sick. Gonzaga had a lot of illness. I think Kansas probably had some guys sick, so I'll give them a little bit of a pass there. But this Houston team is so talented. They got LJ Cryer, a transfer from Baylor, who comes to Houston. It ended up being an interconference transfer as Houston came into the Big 12, but they're really deep. They're really talented offensively and defensively. And I know that the Big 12 has historically gone through Lawrence, Kansas, but I think there's a real chance that Houston ends up being at the top at the end of this year.
Man, I like that. I like maybe Fog Out not being the place where everybody has to go through to make this thing great. You talked earlier about Brett Yormark. Yes, he does love basketball. I mean, he's a basketball dude. He works for the Nets. He did that clinic in New York last year, which I think because of the weather, it didn't go exactly like they wanted to, but it was still a cool idea. He seems to think that there's like untapped potential from a revenue standpoint with basketball. They'll add Arizona and Utah and Arizona State and Colorado. Obviously, U of A is the big draw there. Do you feel like there is some untapped resources and ability to maybe separate those TV deals eventually with the Big 12 as TV and streaming continues to kind of morph and evolve over the next few years?
That's a great question. I definitely think there's untapped potential with college basketball. I mean, it's such a huge event in March. It's massive. It's $1 billion industry. I mean, just speaking anecdotally for what our numbers do in March on Locked On College Basketball, like it is incredibly clear that people are really, really passionate about college basketball for 4 to 6 weeks of the year. Right. And I think what Yormark is banking on or expecting or hoping is that can spread out over more than just, that 4 to 6 weeks in March that we're seeing right now. And the NCAA tournament is such a stalwart. It's such a known commodity, a consistent event. And then you have the brackets and office pools and all this stuff that really kind of turn casual fans into diehards for a few weeks. But getting fans to care about college basketball when football season is happening is hard. And now football season ends and it's transfer portal season, and the amount of attention that gets put on the transfer portal right after football season, or as you're probably experiencing now, kind of before football season's fully over, before the Bulls are even done, it's already a big talking point. And I think that the Big 12 basketball, or just college basketball in general, is going to have to continue to compete with the 24-hour news cycle of college football. And that's going to be hard. But do I think TV deals could eventually be separate? I think so. I think they should be. I think that makes sense. It's a different commodity. It's not always a different audience, but in some ways it can be a bit of a different audience. And I think that being able to say, well, we really care about the Big 12 basketball, but we maybe don't care as much about the football, or, for other conferences like the ACC, as it kind of is fighting for life, quite frankly, right now. Like, can they package their basketball and Duke and Carolina and Virginia and package that into something a little bit different and maybe still keep Florida State and Clemson happy? Who knows? Like, I think there's a lot of options that could be pursued that would allow college basketball to thrive a bit independently of football, which I think is what it needs. And I like that Yormark is looking at that. And again, that's why I think this Gonzaga thing is an important thing, not just for me personally and for Gonzaga fans, but for the sport, because that would be a move indicating, hey, we care about Big 12 basketball as a separate entity from Big 12 football. And that's the kind of move. I mean, if they'd gotten UConn, it would have been the same, even though UConn does have a football team. You're not bringing UConn to the Big 12 for their football team. Everybody knew that, and obviously Gonzaga doesn't even have football, so they're not in that conversation either. And I think if a conference like that is willing to actually make a move that's purely basketball focused, I wonder if that'll start to kind of push some of the dominoes towards some more separation between the two, because I think college basketball needs to get out of college football's shadow, and that's the best way to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. There would be, if they could find a way to kind of get it monetized year round, that would be something that would be good for the sport and good for the league, definitely. What is the ceiling for this TCU basketball team? I'll tell you about that. But first, I need to tell you about how to make some money tonight. Cowboys Seahawks this evening. Cowboys have been great at home. Is your fantasy team, like your yearly season-long fantasy team, is it struggling? Is it in the tank? Don't worry. I got something for you. PrizePicks. It's daily fantasy games. PrizePicks.com/LockedOnCollege. Do you think Dak Prescott's going to throw for over 300 yards tonight against the Seahawks? You can make that wager right now if you'd like. And if you put a first deposit down, if you use the promo code LockedOnCollege, you'll get it matched up to $100. So if you put $20 down on that first deposit, they'll match that right for you. It's free money that you can play with. They have a specials tab where you can do combination projections. It's like games with the NBA and the NFL, both those seasons in full swing right now. You can play against celebrities. It's a place that everybody wants to be. They have a reboot policy. So if your player gets injured, you have some injury insurance. There's no other daily fantasy sports app that has that type of insurance for your money and for your betting. PrizePicks.com/LockedOnCollege. Again, that promo code is LockedOnCollege. First deposit match up to $100. Listen, you're spending a lot of time. You're watching this podcast. You're probably reading a lot of articles. You're into the NFL. You're into the NBA. You're into college sports. Try your hand at making some cash on this at PrizePicks.com/LockedOnCollege. That promo code LockedOnCollege. First deposit match up to $100. So a funny thing that's happened, Andy, and you'll understand this because you know how fans are. I mean, there was a time in my life where I thought TCU making the NCAA tournament was a pipe dream. But now they've kind of gotten stuck on the round of 32 for a few years, and everybody's expectations have changed, and people kind of want to see this group break through. So what do you think the ceiling for this team could be? Could they make it to, the second weekend of the tournament? Are they a group that could be in the top half of a really difficult Big 12? What do you see when you look at this roster?
Hopefully not too many of your listeners are remembering the reason they did not break out of the round of 32.
Oh, yeah.
Taking that out on me here. But, I mean, that TCU team last year was very clearly capable of advancing past the round of 32. They gave Drew Timme and the Zags a whole lot of trouble in that contest. But I think the hard thing about gauging this team right now, obviously, is just the lack of quality competition. I think when you are consistently blowing out bad teams, it is still a positive sign. Certainly if TCU, they could be 6-0, exact same record, and we'd feel a lot more nervous if they, I think their closest game is, I'm looking now, the closest game is 19 points. Like that is the closest game they've played. Again, the quality of competition, you would expect good teams to blow out these teams, but there's a difference between blowing out a few bad teams and then having a couple kind of lackadaisical performances where you skate by with a 14, 16-point victory versus they're pounding teams that they should be beating. 22 points over Omaha, 19 over Alcorn State. I can't even do the math, but a whole bunch over Houston Christian. Like this is a team that is proving they are well above that, well above those teams. And so I think, Ken Pom has them 29th right now, just outside the top 25. I think, like you said, you probably don't put them in the top 25 until they beat a Clemson or Georgetown even will help with that. But I think that this team is probably right in the middle, a little bit above the middle of the Big 12. Okay. 6th or 7th feels about right. The Big 12 is going to get 9 teams in the NCAA tournament, maybe 10, the way that they're playing right now. Certainly depends if there's bid stealers, all that stuff. But I think TCU is a very comfortable NCAA tournament team. I think they're on pace to potentially be hopefully they can get out of that 7 to 10 range. That's the really tough spot in terms of trying to get past the round of 32 because you're playing a 2 seed or a 1 seed in that second round game. If they can get a 6 seed, you got a chance against a 3 seed. Certainly you got to feel pretty good because you'll have played a whole bunch of teams that are 3 seeds or higher in the Big 12. So you'll know what that competition level looks like. I think that this team, it's going to reside a lot on Jameer Nelson Jr. How he continue to play well defensively. He's averaging over 3 steals per game. Can he continue to distribute the basketball? Can that 3-point shot, bump up a little bit for him? But I do, and then we talked about Ernest earlier as well. Can he, stay on the floor a little bit longer? Can he play instead of 15 minutes a game? Can he play 18 or 22? Something like that, and be able to impact the game with his defensive abilities. I think this roster, talent-wise, is Sweet 16 caliber. I have no doubt about that, quite frankly, but it's going to depend on matchups. Of course, it always does, but we haven't seen this team get tested yet, but there is nothing wrong with waiting to get tested when you're in the Big 12, because you're going to get tested every single night from late December until literally the end of the season. Every game is going to be a huge challenge. It'll be interesting to see how this team does against those other kind of teams in the middle, like Iowa State, like BYU now, I think is in that conversation. Texas, I think a lot of people had preseason expectations for them to be top 3 or 4, and they haven't quite looked that good yet. They're still figuring out all their pieces. They also haven't had everybody healthy yet. So once they get their full roster, they might end up kind of climbing back into that top 4 or 5 conversation in the Big 12. But I think TCU's in the mix. I think they'll pull off some upsets. They'll beat some teams that we'll end up talking about on Locked On College Basketball. If they beat, if they take one from Houston, they take one from Kansas even, or Baylor, those are some games that are certainly winnable for them, especially since they'll get 6 games against those 3 teams. But I wouldn't expect them to finish higher than those teams in the state tournament, which could be enough for them, depending on that draw in the second round, to get back into the Sweet 16. From there, anything could happen. I'm not sure TCU is necessarily Final Four or anything like that. At least I wouldn't project that. But again, the Sweet 16, you just need to get hot, and then all of a sudden you might be in that conversation.
What's Drew Timme up to these days? Is he playing overseas?
He's playing with the Wisconsin Herd, the G League team.
Okay.
So, hasn't quite got a shot in the NBA yet, understandably, with his defensive limitations and lack of outside shooting. But he's still stateside, so we'll see if he ends up getting a 2-way and gets a little bit of run up there. Yeah,
I guess I could see. I wish Eddie Lampkin would have been available for that game, but Eddie had kind of a tough season, and I'm not sure he would have been a whole lot of help against Timme. But you're right. And if they could find a way to be, the last couple seasons, Arizona, who they honestly probably should have beat, but couldn't execute down the stretch, and then Gonzaga. Got to find a way to avoid those 1 and 2 seeds in those first couple of rounds, and then maybe you got something cooking, even though they're going to play great competition all year long. Well, he's Andy Patton. You can find him at Andy Patton CBB on Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it. And Locked On College Basketball. Where can everybody find that and subscribe to the various systems, Andy?
Yeah, we got Locked On CBB on Twitter if you want to follow us there. Of course, you can find the show on YouTube. You can find it wherever you're listening here for podcast platforms. Of course, you can find it on Spotify, Apple, et cetera, et cetera. We also have a Discord channel. If you go to one of our shows, you can see in the show notes. You can join us there. Isaac and I are talking hoops 24/7 in there. Our regular guest, Leaf Tulane from the Locked On NBA Big Board, is there as well. So we got a whole Big 12 channel, so people can come in, talk TCU, get our opinions about the team and upcoming games as well. So we'll have a link. Again, the link to that is in the show notes for any of our shows, so you can go find it there, or you can find it on socials as well.
It's Locked On Horned Frogs and Locked On College Basketball, and we appreciate you guys listening, watching. It's your team every day.